Hi Founder fans, Jason here, and today we're going to be talking about the man who arrested the mayor of New York City. Today's focus is on Ezekiel Cornell. Now, Ezekiel Cornell was an everyman from Rhode Island. So, Cornell actually, when he became a man and started his career, he was what was called a mechanic. But it's not a mechanic as we would think of it today, fixing engines and such, of course. Actually, a mechanic was a general word for a skilled laborer. So he would do fairly low-level menial tasks. However, he became a trusted member of his community and was eventually elected to his local town council, and then eventually made his way all the way up in the 1760s to the Rhode Island General Assembly, because he was just a hard worker, an honest and trustworthy individual. So, right before the revolution broke out, he actually was elected as a colonel in his local militia. Very shortly thereafter, of course, Lexington and Concord happened, and as was the case for Massachusetts, Connecticut, and New Hampshire, Rhode Island immediately sent people up to the siege of Boston. A few months later, or few weeks later, maybe about 2 months later, George Washington arrives and they create the Continental Army, and Ezekiel Cornell is assumed into the Continental Army and is promoted to lieutenant colonel, and he does what most people do in the siege of Boston, which is wait outside Boston for something to happen. Eventually, the British do leave Boston, as we know, and they end up going to New York City. And most of the Continental Army trekked from Boston to New York and would go on to have the Battle of Brooklyn and then the British invasion. But Cornell did not go with the rest of the army. He was given a special task of going to Long Island, where he stayed in Hempstead, which was a town at the time full of loyalists. Currently, it's in Nassau County. At the time, it was in technically part of Queens County. But Cornell goes to Hempstead and he takes over St. George's Episcopal Church. Now, this sounds a little blasphemous. First of all, he would not let the constituents pray for the king or for Great Britain. He famously refused to let them pray for that. He also used their sacrament table for his soldiers to eat at, which I find strange. I was unable to determine what Cornell's particular religion was. They were, like I said, an Episcopal church they were at. He must have had a different denomination, but it's still, this is after the First Great Awakening, and there was more of an understanding between religions at that point, so I'm surprised he did this. But either way, it happened. Cornell then gets a task. It is revealed that a man named Thomas Hickey, who was a member of Washington's Lifeguards, which were more or less his CIA, his bodyguards, he was a member of a plot to assassinate Washington. Now, Hickey's caught, and I don't know what they do to him, but they have him convince him to reveal some of his co-conspirators, one of whom was David Matthews, who was mayor of New York City. Not Dave Matthews of Dave Matthews Band, David Matthews, who had been mayor of New York City. So Ezekiel Cornell is given the task of arresting David Matthews, and he does this. He brings some men, they track him down, capture him, and they bring him off to prison, and then they send him up to Connecticut to wait trial. Now, as a upper crust gentleman, Matthews, like many of the higher level loyalists, was given extreme leniency when it came to his everyday life. It was kind of more or less parole. They called it parole. It was kind of like house arrest, but it's like, yeah, you can go to the store if you want. And so Matthews escapes pretty quickly. He would eventually make his way back to New York City after the British take control, and he would regain the position of mayor for the entire duration of the war until he would leave with the British. As for Cornell, he had a job well done, and he was promoted to Deputy Adjutant General of the Continental Army. Deputy Adjutant General. I think that's how it's pronounced, but I am very bad at pronouncing things, especially when I read them for my whole life before I hear people say it. Basically, in this position, he was one of a few assistants to the Adjutant General, and the position was administrative. It was the carrying out of the army. To a degree, parts of the army need to be run like a business, and he assisted with the overseeing of the business side of things. About a year later, he is promoted to Brigadier General, and he spends several years as Brigadier General, leading men in several important battles. Most notably, he played a leading role in the Battle of Rhode Island, which was unfortunately a losing effort for the Patriots. After 5 years, Ezekiel Elliott, sorry football fans, Ezekiel Cornell decides to resign from the army, because 5 years is a good amount of your lifetime. And very quickly he is elected by the delegates of the constituents of Rhode Island as a delegate to the Continental Congress. And he goes there. He plays a fairly moderate role. He doesn't have a lot of famous speeches or anything of that nature. His biggest moment of note is he's there. He doesn't sign the Articles of Confederation, but he's there when Maryland finally signs the Articles, and the transition from the Continental Congress into what we would consider the Continental, my name escapes me, not association, the Confederation Congress. I apologize. So many C's with all the Congresses. Technically, the people at the time called the Continental Congress all the way until the Constitution was ratified. But as historians, to differentiate the difference between the Continental Congress and then the government after the Articles, we tend to call it the Confederation Congress. So he was there for that change. And then after that, he pretty much ends up going back to Rhode Island, where he lives. He continues as a leading member of his state, but he doesn't do anything on the national stage. He never really excels too high up in the levels of government. Again, this man was simply a laborer who just happened to be very smart and very hardworking and extraordinarily trustworthy. So that, my friends, is the time that Ezekiel Cornell. I should note, I did look into it because the name Cornell sounds like a college, an Ivy League school in upstate New York, about an hour from here. Although the names both come from the same person who a century earlier had come to the United States, he is not really, he's very super distantly related to the man who started Cornell College. So, that is the story of Ezekiel Cornell, a brigadier general from the Continental Army, who arrested the mayor of New York City. That's a fun way to end the week, I think. I'm going to take off, and you know what? I will see you on Monday.